Good afternoon and welcome to this session of the Florida Libraries Online Fostering Resilient Communities Virtual Conference. My name is Raymond Neal and I'm the Continuing Education Coordinator for Nephlin. This session is part of our Friends and Support Group track brought to you by Nephlin. This session is Funding Your Library, collaborating with friends groups and foundations, as presented by Pat Wagner. There will be time at the end of the presentation for your questions and comments. Please use the chat box to interact with Pat and your fellow attendees and leave your microphones muted. You will receive an email shortly after today's conference containing a link to a brief survey on your experiences with the conference. Please complete the survey. This gives us guidance on developing events for Florida Library staff and makes an impact on our funding for the future. You will also receive a link to a copy of the recording of this session. Now let's start talking about Pat. Pat Wagner is a trainer and consultant who has worked with libraries, universities, and allied institutions since 1978. She's been a frequent visitor to Florida libraries and a very frequent trainer for us here at Nephlin. We're very happy to bring you this newest presentation of hers. And with that, I'm just going to sit back and enjoy the rest of the show and let y'all experience Pat. So take it away, Pat.
Raymond, thank you very much, and thank you folks for joining us today. As Raymond said, I've been working for libraries for many, many years now, but I also been working in the nonprofit sector. So in talking about funding today, I'm also talking about many of the things I've learned being a fundraiser and grant writer in the nonprofit world as well. And I wanted to mention that the images that we might use today are from pixabay.com. We support them, and we hope that you would too. Several things we hope happen out of today. One is to strengthen relationship with library donors. And library donors include the people who put a few cents in a jar at a circ desk and the people who basically write you into their wills for everything they own. To kind of understand that there's different kinds of money out there and to take advantage of what kinds of money's out there and where they are and how you can use them, to be able to grow and sustain your financial base. And I'm not going to be talking about tax dollars today. I'm going to be talking about all the different kinds of ways that you can raise money for your library, and building relationships with people who are money managers, people who know about money, investment counselors and bankers and CPAs and all the different people who deal with money as a commodity. And I think this is important, is for your library leadership, which includes your directors, your deans, your elected and appointed boards, and so on, for them to better understand their fundraising duties. And this gets a little controversial, I know, but I want to present it as an idea. And even though it might be a little controversial, it's not the Pat Wagner view. It's really kind of a standard view of fundraising and so on. And then when you're talking about working with your friends group and your foundations, that whole thing of written contracts, I visit towns where there has been so much rage among different people involved in fundraising and supporting the libraries that you have a little town, and I'm not making this up, of 1,500 people that has two friends groups who are not speaking to each other with different fundraising programs that they're doing for the library. All it does is confuse the heck out of the people who live in the town and doesn't make anybody look very good, right? So we're going to talk a little bit about written contracts as well. So I always start a program like this with, we call it the legal small print. Every one of you has different legal constraints that you have to work with in your town, in your city, in your county, in your district, in your school district, whatever. I am not a lawyer, you're not a lawyer. And so before you start a big campaign of some kind, you better check with the legal authorities who would actually defend your library in court. And I say this because I'm still horrified how many people get into social media and start asking advice online about legal issues that they have. No, no, no. You go to the person who actually is going to write something down. And notice I say written advice, that their advice is so sound, they're willing to put it on a piece of paper over their signature. So on some of the stuff I'm talking about, even if it makes sense to you, please check it with the legal authorities who help govern your library. Okay, promise? Thank you. All right. So raising funds, let's sort of kind of go through some of the things. When you're raising funds, one of the things that you have to determine is where the money's going to go. And some libraries, for example, municipal libraries, even if you're working with a foundation or a friends group or a third-party granting organization, guess what? The money you raise go right into the general fund of that municipality or county. So let's find out where the money goes. And however, in other cases, you're able to raise money and it goes into the library's general fund, which means that you can determine how you're going to spend the money. The hardest thing to get money for is the overhead of running a library, like salaries, for example, and wages and benefits. So knowing what you can do with that money is something you should do before you seriously start raising money. Usually that money that you're raising is things that might not be allowed under public funds or people think is extra. For example, I spend a lot of time going around the country doing training programs and such for libraries of all sizes. And I would say right now about half the time, the check I get is from the Library Foundation or Friends Group, because locals think, it's kind of superfluous to bring in an outside person. So they won't allow the library to use its budget for that. So marketing and all the extras like training come out of that particular budget. And that's one reason we do it. Another reason that you might be raising money is because you have a long-term loan, that you have funding issues, that there are guesses people made years ago, and you've got that overhead of having to pay something off. So this pays off that loan or funding thing. Or you're looking into the future and you're trying to save money because you want to do a big remodel, build a new branch, build a new building. And the other thing is, in this day and age, oftentimes we want to show support for other agencies and groups and organizations. Now, many times a publicly funded library is forbidden from giving money to other organizations, other government agencies, or to nonprofit organizations. So it may be that you want to show support for groups that you feel are allied, like, for example, a literacy group, for example, and, sort of helping the bigger issues that are happening in your community. And that would be another reason for having that money that's coming from a non-governmental source. Before we go any further, I want to talk about 3 resources that I think people don't pay enough attention to when it comes to funding for libraries. The first one is brand new, and I found it while I was doing research for this program. It's called Candid, and for many, many years, many of you would be familiar with the Foundation Center, which was a national nonprofit that actually had centers, had places within large public libraries where people could do all kinds of research about grants and finding foundations and groups that would give people money. Super, super group. There also are several groups, including one called Charity Navigators, that became the groups that did kind of a nonprofit oversight over the whole funding world. So if you were going to give money to a particular group, Charity Navigator and those groups would take a look at it. Well, what happened last year is the Foundation Center decided to combine with Charity Navigators, and they've created what I think is this incredibly awesome site with thousands and thousands of resources for any kind of nonprofit organization. And for right now, we'll call a library a nonprofit organization that might be seeking to educate themselves about grants and foundations and sources of money. So applause for all of that, for all of us for that. The second thing is that my absolute favorite source for books and training on the nonprofit world is Wiley and Sons. And those of you in the library world know it very, very well. Very fine nonfiction publishing house. And they have the best set of books having to do with running nonprofit organization, including a whole set of incredible stuff on fundraising and donors and money and all that kind of thing. They're absolutely great, and they are priced reasonably, if you get my drift. They're priced as trade paperbacks, not as academic books. So please take a look at them, and I hope that you acquire some for your library. And then finally, of course, we have the American Library Association for United for Libraries groups, and this is the group that focuses on friends and foundations and stuff, and they have tons of free resources. So we're very lucky in library land that we have 3 such great resources available to us. All right. So first I'm going to start out with what I call random key ideas. And these were things as I was putting it together, I thought, I don't know what order they should be in, but I wanted to share with you. So number 1, and this is something everyone who gets involved with money in a nonprofit has to deal with, is being comfortable with money. A lot of people hate money, hate finances, think that rich people are evil, that they are not demeaned in the library land by worrying about money. I remember a few years ago, the Nebraska libraries were in trouble financially because there was going to be a cut in the property tax that supported many libraries. And at that time, they thought something like 1/3 of the public libraries in Nebraska would have to close. So the Nebraska Library Commission sent me around the state with folks from the commission to talk about fundraising and money. Well, this upset some people, and we had a lady stand up, a library director stand up in one of the programs, and she said, "I didn't go to library school to become a director and worry about money." Those are pretty much exactly what she said. And so because I can be sarcastic, I apologize. I said to her, "So up to now, the Nebraska Library brownie has come to the back door of your building and left you a bag of gold coins every year, right?" And she said, "Well, yeah, that's right." And I said, "Well, those days are over." So what we have to do is to get the mindset that money's a tool. And even if other people don't use it for good, guess what? You're going to use it for good. So people have to be willing to work with money and understand money as a tool. Here's some things that you can measure yourself by, and you might bring this recording back and the slides back to talk to people at your library and sort of say, okay, how good are we at this? Whether it be a marketing committee, an outreach committee that you work on with people who use and support the library. It might be your elected or appointed board of directors. First of all, how much do you individually know about your library's finances? And know where the money goes, how much is spent for different things, what kinds of new expenses are coming in. It's almost like you sat down once a year and looked at the budget for the coming year for your family and then checked in once a month. Could you read a financial statement? If you were sitting around with a bunch of people, could you see what was going on? I do not have a background in finance, but having a small business, I've had to learn about money over the years. And for a time, I worked as a researcher and on-air talent, don't get excited, for a radio talk show here in Denver. And they were on the air for about a year and a half. And toward the end of their reign, the director, a wonderful guy named Doug, said to me that he said, "You know about finances a little bit." And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "You can read a profit and loss statement." I said, "Sure." So he said, "Could you look at this and see if there's any mistakes in it?" And I looked, and I noticed that the line item for my department had been crossed off and deleted. And so I went back to his office and I said, "Doug, is this how you're telling me I'm fired?" And he went, "Oh my goodness, Pat, I'm so sorry. I forgot that you're the only one on the staff who knows how to read a P&L statement." And I said, "Yeah, thank you." And we had a nice talk, and we're still buddies after years, but I thought that was kind of amusing. What about the situation of those institutions that fund your library? I've just got word of one of my clients in Wisconsin where they've suffered a tremendous tax hit, the municipality, because of the virus. It's a resort community in the Midwest, and they have just had to um, lay off 15 people, and they're devastated by that. So are you keeping an eye out for all the different groups and organizations at the local, state, and national level who might be funding your library? What about the contracts, the money that's encumbered that you don't have any choice, but you have to pay. Sometimes it's contracts with things like insurance. Everybody knows, you have a certain insurance overhead, or the amount of money in withholding that has to be taken out of everybody's paycheck. And yeah, that's there. You can't do anything about it. But maybe there's other kind of licensing. I've run into, for example, libraries that didn't realize, if you looked at the fine print, they paid the city back for the right to use the parking lot next to the library. That was something that people weren't aware of. Or the lease on a building. Maybe it isn't $1 a year. Maybe it's just a normal lease on a building, and that particular landlord, who may or may not be from the government, might decide to raise that lease, raise the amount of rent people are paying. And I think what this is really important, some people call it the elevator speech. If you're out there raising money for your library, do you feel that you have a good, concise way of talking about why the library has to raise more money than it gets from taxes? Why? Because there's a lot of fiscally conservative people who are going to rightly say, my taxes keep going up every year to support the library, and you're saying it's never enough? What's going on? So you have to figure out a way that suits them, that satisfies them, if you have to go and ask them for money. So these are all money skill things that we need to develop if we need to talk to people out there about money issues for the well. Key idea number two, and people laugh at this one, but it's true. There are actually people in your community who want to give you money, and you've never asked them. I think a good example of this, and this is my soapbox, folks, has bothered me for years. Remember, I'm an evil business gal working as a consultant and supporter for libraries for many, many years. And I was just having this conversation with one of the officers of our state association here in Colorado. We were talking about fundraising, and they were talking about, having different kinds of sales, fundraising ideas. And I said, I've been active in the state association since 1984, and I'm a small business owner, and no one ever in all these years has ever come to me and say, Pat, we know you support libraries. Would your business be willing to make a donation? Never. And she was sort of shocked. And I said, we have a lot of businesses in our state that support libraries, that like libraries. We're not the kind of state that has a lot of Fortune 500 companies like New Jersey or New York, but nonetheless, we have companies. And I'm just keep wondering, if you ever make a list of prosperous companies and just say, your local libraries, the ones that serve your families and your schools and your small businesses, need money, just to get some money from them. This is an idea that seems to puzzle a lot of people in library land. And sometimes when you go and see them, because I've seen and hear it happen myself, sometimes the person's actually going to say, well, we were wondering why you never asked us. We just assumed you must not need the money about things. And in small towns, you may have wealthy people, and they may be people, for example, in a rural area that, they're going to wear old blue jeans like everyone else, but they got money in the bank and they like to do a little philanthropy, and nobody has ever asked them for money. No one has ever sought them. And we can fool ourselves who has money or not. My parents did well. My parents came from immigrants' families. They did well in America. They both were generous in donations to all kinds of groups. But my mom was a very average person. She wore average clothes. She didn't wear a lot of jewelry or anything like that. And she looked a little, let's just be honest with this, sometimes a little dowdy, not fancy at all. And I took her to a theater program of an independent theater in Wisconsin when I lived there. And mom loves the arts and loves theater and loves young people. And she had a check burning in her pocket that she was so delighted that she could share with the people at the theater company. I really kind of talked them up to her. And we got there, and the people who were at the front desk actually made fun of my mother of the way she was dressed. And she wasn't dressed weird or anything, but she wasn't dressed fancy or anything like that. And they actually made fun of her. And we saw the first half of the program, and I could see Mom was uncomfortable. And I said, Mom, I'm sorry, let's leave. And she said, thank you. And she went out, and I said, I'll be right back. So then I pulled a little pretty woman, and I went back and I said, that old lady you were making fun of? And they went, oh, and I said, yeah, she had $1,000 in her pocket. She was going to give you guys. I guess this will be a lesson next time not to make fun of people. So you can't even necessarily assume who in your community actually has money and what they want to spend the money on. Now, this is the thing that we call the money test, and this is probably one of the more controversial things that I'll be talking about today. Sometimes, and I was trying to be accurate about this, I would say about a dozen times in my career working with nonprofit organizations, the issue was they were running out of money. Maybe they had one source that they were counting on, maybe the economy in their part of the country wasn't doing very well. And what they wanted to do was to hire someone to, quote, raise money for them. And they wanted me to help them hire that person. They knew I wasn't that person, but they wanted to get ready and wanted advice about how to hire them. And in the room, we might have the board of the nonprofit, we might have the employees of the nonprofit, and then we might have the inner circle of supporters, the volunteers who felt very strongly about the cause. So this is the exercise we would have them do. And by the way, I've also done this not just with everyday nonprofits, but with churches as well. So what I had them do is make a list of their 20 closest friends and families, neighbors, whatever, who don't work at the library. And, or in this case, the nonprofit. So they'd make a list of people who weren't in the room that they knew. And then I said, okay, could you ask each of those people for a donation to your nonprofit? And if not, why not? Oh my goodness. Talk about the Tower of Babel. People were very upset. They were very defensive about what they were doing and everything. And I said, it's interesting. 2 points I want to make. This cause that you're involved in is something you absolutely believe in, but you don't believe in it enough to ask people you trust and like to help you with some money. Even if they're broke, if they could give $1. Asking people for a money is mostly a compliment. It's a way to engage them and a way to feel that they're supporters. So I don't agree with the model that some people have, that you only ask rich people for money. No, I ask everyone for money about stuff. And I said, if you don't believe enough in what you're doing, or if you think money is evil, that you can't ask people for money for the thing that you personally think is most important in your life, what does this say about you hiring in an outsider? Like, do you think asking for money is like this dirty, terrible thing, and you need somebody else to do it for you? If you bring in a outside fundraiser, grant writer or something, this is one of the first questions they're going to ask you as well. And if you can't resolve them before you bring them in, that's going to be a problem. And then I went on to say, how many people in the room have friends and families who are part of causes who have approached them for money? And you know what? Almost every hand in the room went up. And I started, just as I was putting this program together, thinking about all the different causes that my husband and I have given money to. Sometimes, not huge amounts, might be $10, $25, maybe if we're feeling really rich that day, $100. But just in the past few weeks, we have given money to support research on brain cancer for children, pediatric brain cancer issue, gave money to a nonprofit that runs an animal shelter in another state run by a friend of mine who's a retired librarian who's now the executive director, supported a men's homeless shelter in the winter, we bought mittens, and then we bought towels, clean towels, worked with a bookstore that the owner is part of a religious group. And what they do is when they find low income housing, and get somebody an apartment. Usually there's nothing in the apartment, it's bare, and so they furnish it and get furnishing and things like that, and we have spent money on that. So I started making a list, and I think, oh, I helped a friend who was doing a historical film for a project in Chicago, sent her some money. So I look at this list and I say, I am accustomed to not being a wealthy person at all, just an average middle class person, having people who believe in stuff ask me for money. Never any of my library clients have asked me for money directly. Ask me for money directly. So this is something you kind of have to look in your heart. If you really think money is evil, is that going to color how you're talking about money in the greater community? And I have to remind people, some people say it's unprofessional to ask for money. And I'm like, really? Doctors are always applying for grants. I have friends who are real scholars in their field, have PhDs and stuff. They're always applying for fellowships. They're always writing out, give me money, give me money. Engineers, we have some friends who are inventors, and they enter these contests. It's not just for kids. It's like, oh my goodness, here's a company that'll give you $1 million if you do and this or that, and they apply for that. We've had people who have written books and articles for money and actually have applied for contests. There's some really good groups out there like Donors Choice, and teachers are always writing funds for projects. They shouldn't have to, but they do. City managers, people who are elected appointed officials, are always looking for money for different things. And yes, charities ask and ask. So the idea that, oh, if you're a degreed professional, it's demeaning to ask for money. Well, you might talk to some other professionals out there. They may say something different to you as well. Key idea number 3, there are different kinds of money. There are different kinds of money. And it has a lot to do with scope and scale. How much money and what's the source of the money and how is the money managed? So in library land, we have an interesting issue. We have 3 groups that deal with money. We have the library itself, that probably is, as most public libraries are, but even in the world of academic school libraries and such, it's funded by taxes. So you have this government entity. In some cases, in some part of the country, like in New England and Pennsylvania, and I don't know how much this is true in Florida, you have libraries that actually are nonprofit 501c3s that have a contract with a local government agency and stuff, but you have the library. Then you have the Friends group, and then you have the foundation. And they have to work together with no legal oversight over each other. The library can't tell the Friends and the foundation what to do, and vice versa, even though everybody tries, but they don't have legal clout necessarily. And so figuring out how to govern those relationships is key to having a sustainable funding base. Here's the 3 kinds of money. Now, first of all, let's talk about the money that, and this is arbitrary because it might be different where you are. So I'm doing the usual, this is a model, and model isn't really real life. But usually what a friends group does is it deals with what we like to call short-term money. Short-term money is usually selling something. It's a small amount of money relative. It's the kind of thing that is an impulse, right? You do have the gift coin jar, you have the wishing well, or something like that. Also selling tickets to events, that kind of thing. And that usually is what the Friends do in most cases, that the Friends organization deals with what we call the short-term money. Now, if you really stare at this slide, we have another little controversy, because notice I put the book sale, and if you have a thrift store of some kind, or a secondhand store, or even an antique store. I saw one library that had a really great volunteer who actually had some experience in retailing, and had lovely gifts and antiques that she had in that particular library. But book sales, okay, everyone knows how wonderful they are. I need to warn you about a couple of things. At first glance, it may be that it looks like the book sale is bringing in a lot of money. What we often don't count is first of all, the overhead of how much it's costing the library or related organizations to bring in that money. And then the second thing is, if you start counting up the number of people who are involved, is that the best use of their time? We had a situation in this part of the country with a very large city library that was very proud of the tens of thousands of dollars that were brought in from the book sale. But then they got in a new director who knew a little bit about finance, and he actually sat down and worked the numbers. The first thing he found out was that the book sale was about 1% of the budget, if that. But the second thing he found out was the amount that the book sale was bringing in was totally negated by the cost of the 2 full-time employees from the library that devoted pretty much their whole year to managing the book sale. And when you did the math, the book sale was actually costing the library $10,000 a year. So they took the library book sale back from the Friends group, who were not happy about that, changed how it was done, and made it something that was more profitable. But I see people who that's all they pay attention to. And the book sale itself, which sometimes means hundreds of books, may be taking up, as one director said, some very valuable real estate in our library. And they finally got rid of the book sale, which really upset people. But then they had room for a nice teen center, for a nice YA center. Sometimes it's a little group of people who are very possessive about what it is they do. And guess what? When the nice books come in, who gets the first pick? The volunteers from the book group. So pretty soon people know it's not worth going unless you don't mind shabby books and old bestsellers, because if there's anything really good that's been donated, that little clique's going to pick it. And it's not sometimes competently run, not because people aren't smart about doing things, but they don't really understand retailing, and they have so much fun looking at the books, they don't do it in a very efficient way. So all I'm urging you to do is to look at your own book sales with clear eyes and say, is this the best way that we can raise money? And yes, you do engage people and get them to come in, and we do want people to build their home libraries. You know, that's a value most libraries I work with have. Nonetheless, when we start talking about raising money, is this actually the best way to fund your library? Maybe not, maybe not. Then we have what we call midterm money, and it's not short term, it's not long term, it's midterm. And this is what libraries do. And it's about money for a program that might be for 3 months, a year, or 2 years. This is where we talk about people going after grants, including foundation, government money of different kinds, and special interest, which I think is pretty important. I'm going to come back to that. Sometimes a corporation will give money through its foundation. Other times the corporation will make, or business will make, a direct donation to a library, even if the library doesn't operate as a 501c3, as a tax donation, because they can take it out of their advertising budget. And sometimes tax-wise, that makes more sense to them. It might be a wealthy family likes to give money to together. And again, when you have those specific campaigns, as we've mentioned before, for equipment or buildings or specific programs, it's the library that's probably raising the money. And this is the smaller gifts and bequests. One director I know in the Midwest had a beautiful fundraising brochure made up for the library, and she put that brochure in all the funeral parlors in her city. And she said it worked because people would come in and they'd be grieving and talking about what's going on. And then they'd look over and see the nice little brochure and they'd say, heck, you know, Uncle Fred didn't leave anything in his will about any charitable bequests. Wow, I really like the library. I'm going to give the library somebody. And I told her, I said, that's absolutely shameless. And she was very proud. She said, yes, it is totally shameless. And it works. So it's those smaller kinds of pieces of money. Now, this is the long-term foundation money, and it's not to say that friends groups and libraries don't evolve, but this is where you get the real bucks. This is where you get the money that can make the long-term just real effort as far as supporting your library, the sustainability. First of all, having the money that you bring in become part of investments and annuities. And there are people out there who specialize in investing money for groups like foundations, community foundations, and government groups, and keep an eye on it to grow the money so that you know, you have more money tomorrow than you did yesterday. Some people totally freak at that because they have kind of a depression era mentality that we should stick all the money in a mattress. And I have people who brag about the fact that their library has an endowment of $1 million that's basically sitting in a checking account somewhere because it feels safe. So this is where we have to educate ourselves about what's going on. And annuities are where we invest the money, and somebody has given us a chunk of money and they get some money from it until they die, and then the library would get the bulk of the money that was left. And I was pretty impressed recently. We had an older relative who passed on, and I'm one of the people going through the files, and I found that she was getting a sizable check every year from a liberal arts college that she and her husband had donated money to for years. And we've contacted the college, and she's passed on, and she said this was a way of helping the college with her getting some income while she was alive and them getting the bulk of it. Those larger bequests, like with the funeral home brochure, and the kinds of people who you want on the board who are working with it are people who are going to be managing the money long term. They are, yes, money managers. Endowments can be a buffer in bad times. It's not something that you necessarily spend year to year. It might be also large gifts of money, but also might be gifts of real estate. I know a library in Louisiana that I think was gifted some real estate, and they have been, in effect, buying and selling real estate to leverage what they have and what they can do in their community. Sometimes large corporate grants, and sometimes the library foundation is actually a community foundation or has a relationship with a larger foundation as well. So that's what the foundations do as far as that kind of big money sort of thing. Now, here's a little caveat that comes from a friend of mine named Annette. And Annette Chosick was a library director, branch manager and library director here in Colorado for many years. And it must have been, 35 years ago, in the little town of Glendale, which is actually an urban community right in the center of Denver proper, that one of the local groups brought in a whole bunch of refugees from Russia, people who did not speak English, often were elderly, were poor, had health issues. They may never become American citizens. So suddenly, Annette was expected to serve these people, and the city, Glendale, was broke. They had no money, and the library was a room in the city building. So Annette went out and started looking for grant money. She started looking for money for immigrants, for new Americans, different kind of refugee groups, ethnic groups, poverty-related groups, whatever she could find out there. And she said, you know what was interesting? These were cause-related groups that perfectly dovetailed into the mission of her library. And most of the time when she walked into the room where they would tell people about the grant and what was involved, she would be the only library person there, even though she knew that there were other libraries in the community who also were dealing with similar issues. And she was able to fund incredible programs and support the library in amazing ways and press the heck out of the city officials, I'll tell you that. She ended up winning national awards. And she said, and she used to speak on this when she was an active librarian. She said, it's like librarians have blinders on when they think about where the money is that they might get support for their library things as well. Key idea number 4, don't rely on one kind of money. And I think a lot of libraries I visit rely on that short-term money, right? The equivalent of the book sale, the bake sale, tickets to an event. And that's all they think about. They don't think about midterm or even long-term money. And they spend too much time and money chasing too few dollars. So the Library Foundation, as I said before, it raises and manages the largest amounts of money. Um, and they're the ones who have the big picture people, are the big picture people. So that's where you want your foundation folks to be, again, money people, lawyers, and so on. The Friends group has three main purposes, in my opinion. First is raising funds for the library. Second is if you use a library, if your library uses volunteers, and not all libraries do or can use volunteers, but if you have volunteers for various things, they help recruit volunteers, not just to support what the Friends group is doing, but to help send the word out that you're looking for people to help with maybe special events or something, and then advocating for the library. And because they don't have a paycheck from the library, they have more credibility and the greater community about asking for funding for libraries than people who work for the library do. We always have to remind people that there are very, very strict rules having to do with tax-exempt charities not getting involved in politics. And libraries get in trouble with this, and friends groups get in trouble, and foundations get in trouble. So the allies need to come up with a different group that is just for supporting the library politically and advocating strongly for the politics, meaning that you're going to the polls or you're advocating for a particular elected official who's a supporter of libraries, and making sure that you have that differentiation. So in some places I visit, they actually have another person. They have another group, in effect, that does all of that kind of political work for them as well. So just kind of have to remember that, get you in trouble. Now, here's some things that should be warning signals about foundations and friends groups that you might be working with or for. One, you need to, if you're new in your library in particular and you hear about the friends group, the foundation group, you can now go to, for example, candid.org, or you can go to your Secretary of State's office online, and you should be able to type in the name of that friends group and or foundation and find them listed with the state of Florida, that they and that they are in good standing, meaning that they have filed all the right forms. And you should be also able to look up on the IRS site, and I think it's still called a 990 form, and where they are required to file all their tax forms every year. It's all public information. Now, if you can't find that, that's a problem. And I have found people who have said, oh, that doesn't apply to us because we're small. Oh, that doesn't apply to us because we were grandfathered in because this is the old woman's club and we've been doing this for 50 years. I've heard people say it. And basically they're running it out of a shoebox in someone's home. It's not that they're doing anything illegal in terms of stealing money, but they are misrepresenting themselves if they say that people can write it off on their taxes, for example. And what you have to be worried about is some sort of financial and legal oversight, that there's actually not a governing board of some kind who's holding themselves responsible for making sure things go right, that there aren't things written down that you're counting on the goodwill that you have with a particular person. Records aren't being kept. In some cases, there's an issue of elitism. It really doesn't represent the greater community that it serves. It's sort of, excuse me, but some old society ladies who've been around for 100 years. So there's prestige belonging to the group, but they're totally out of touch of what's happening with the average person in their community. They aren't able to recruit because they're seen as this in group. And so these are signals that you have to check in with them if they really are a group that you want to do business with. That's something to be careful about. And legal contracts. And we have to remind ourselves that the contracts we put in with each other are for when we are still speaking to each other. We don't wait until we are angry with each other to try to get things written down. And it doesn't have to be in stuffy legal language, even though you do want a lawyer to look over it. But you have to decide who gets to make what decisions regarding money that's being raised by a foundation or a friends group. And it's the library that gets to decide at the end of the day, and not someone who says, here's $10,000, and if you don't spend it the way we like, we're not going to work with you anymore. So this is the thing about what we call special interest groups. Allies, by which I mean foundation and friends groups, can't be allowed to pull more weight than any other taxpayer or library user. It's also called green mail. They can have input, but they don't actually have that legal right. So you have to have a good relationship with them to talk about what you want to make, raise money for. Now, there's no problem at all of a friends group saying, we would like to help support the children's area and help with the remodel and new carpeting. And the library says, oh, great idea, this is wonderful. But the friends group can't come in and say, we're going to withhold funds that were supposed to go into the general fund because we don't like how you're spending it. That gets a little tricky. And again, nobody has legal oversight over each other. So all you have are contracts, okay? So what do you need to do next? Make sure that your own organizations act together, together in terms of your relationship with money, that you have influence to be able to work with these other allied groups and create these legal agreements. And you know what? Be prepared for people to be upset with you because you want to have more formal relationships. Now with that, I'm going to turn things back over to Raymond and see if we have any questions or comments.
Okay, let's see. Let's give folks a minute or two to type here into the chat box, if you would, please, folks. Um, what your thing there just a second ago kind of reminded me of an issue on a previous job of mine where we had a friends group for this particular library whose goals ran a little contrary to that of the library itself.
Mm-hmm.
One thing was they wanted this particular branch to be open 7 days a week, which was not something that would ever be in the plans for a
Mm-hmm.
very small neighborhood branch.
Right.
Um, so, and basically, I never touched that. I didn't say anything to them about it or bring up
Mm-hmm.
any any thoughts on that. But um, is that the approach for a situation like that, or is there something better to do?
Well, I'll tell you the worst one quickly, and this I'll tell you it happened in Connecticut that somebody gave a huge amount of money, $1 million, not to the library, but to the branch. So the library only had two buildings. It had the main building and had a branch, and the person left the money to the branch. And so the branch created its own nonprofit foundation to keep the money. And I'm not making this up, Raymond. They argued about how to spend the money for 20 years. Well, the IRS wants you to spend money. They got really upset when they figured out that money was just sitting there, gathering interest and not being spent for what it was supposed to be. So the IRS literally gave them, I can't remember, like 6 months where they had to either spend the money or everyone went to jail. They called me in because I happened to be in the state. And I said, what you need to do is go in front of an arbitration judge, somebody who could listen to what's going on and, like Solomon, cut the baby in half. But there was no plan put in place, and these people argued about how that money should be spent and what it should be used for 20 years. So when in doubt, that's why we have a court system in America, if need be.
Yeah, that would be an uncomfortable situation,
Yes.
to
Yeah,
be in,
it was. It
say the
was.
least.
Fortunately, most of the people in town had a sense of humor. They thought it was pretty amusing that was like people entertaining themselves for years arguing over that $1 million. And of course, they were in a really difficult position because I don't think the nice person who left them the money did it on purpose, but didn't realize the legal snafu it would cause by doing it the way they did.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Well, let's put a pin in this one for now,
Okay,
and possibly pick up this discussion at some point in the near future. But as for today's entertainment, I think we are done with it. And Pat, thank you for the wonderful presentation as always.
my pleasure.
And thanks to all of you who attended today. I hope you enjoyed yourselves. I know I sure did. And that's it. That brings our conference to a close for this first year. And yes, I do say first year because we do plan on doing this again next year. So Just as I mentioned at the beginning, you're going to see a survey come out to you shortly, asking you some things about how you feel about this and what you may want to see next year. Please fill that out and get that back to us, because that's going to guide us on what we're going to do next year. So, again, thank you, Pat.
My pleasure.
Okay. And we will see y'all at some point down the line. Thanks for coming.